this process of selling off companies is happening right now. There are companies that are being taken over. I mean, two big defence companies, Ultra and Megit, were sold in the last 3 or 4 years. It's not just that we gave up what industry we had, we're still giving it up. It's a process that's going on right now, and it ought to be a big issue in the current general election.
You'll sometimes hear the phrase that Britain is the 51st state. And it's inarguable that the United Kingdom does have a very profound, strong, historic relationship with the US, not least because we share a language. When that term 51st state is appealed to, it often means military alliances or culture, film, books, music. But what if Britain increasingly was subordinated to, shaped by the United States when it comes to business and the economy? And what if that subordination had intensified to an extraordinary extent over recent decades? Of course, the baton of power was passed across the Atlantic after the Second World War. That's nothing new. But the arrival of the internet and the tech giants we take for granted, from Meta to Alphabet, seemingly compound US power around the world, but nowhere more so than right here in the UK. Today's guest has written a brilliant book about Britain's economic and business dependence on the United States and how, more importantly, that shapes the political decisions we make here right at home. Angus Hanton, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you.
I often say at the start of an interview, I really enjoyed the book. It was so informative. I have to say this was surprisingly informative. I think it's one of the best books I'll read this year, certainly one of the most important. Before we get onto it, though, to establish some of your authority, your credentials, a moment ago we were talking about a very shrewd investment you made a long time ago in a gentleman called Warren Buffett. Can you illuminate that a little, please?
Well, it actually wasn't a shrewd investment. It just turned out to look like that. I bought one share in Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, and it cost £2,000 at the time in the late 1980s, and it's now worth £630,000, or $1,000 actually, so £500,000. And I did it just to get hold of the annual reports. In those days, you couldn't look them up on the internet, so you needed to get them sent to you, so you could read them. And I get them once a year still, so it's worked out well. But I think Berkshire Hathaway is a bit of a symbol of American capitalism. It's been an operator in the UK. It's been the operator of businesses in the US, but it's also been an investor, and it's very much focused on how it allocates its capital, and it's very much focused on going for businesses with high margins that have what Warren Buffett calls moats, that are defensible, and that's probably typical of many American businesses.
So this book, Vassal State, How America Runs Britain. We've got a hard copy here, immaculate hard copy. I thought we'd show my well-thumbed one instead. All my notes. It really is. It's sensational. It's got so many great facts and vignettes in it. And the essential hypothesis is that the business relationship, and of course that percolates through to politics and to geopolitics and military and whatnot, but the business relationship between the UK and the US is quite unique, particularly when you compare it to, say, the US's relationships to other European countries. So what is so spectacular about America's business presence in the United Kingdom?
It's mostly its scale. They have just got so many businesses that they've owned for a long time, and that have expanded. But there have been these two great prongs of American expansion in the last 15 years. The tech businesses, so the big 5 or 6, whoever you want to count, Apple, Google, Microsoft and so on, but also private equity. So private equity is a much more under the radar activity, but it's dominated by US companies, Apollo, KKR, Silver Lake, and these Blackstone, of course, and these companies have really taken over huge swathes of the British economy, and so that's the kind of scale of domination, but it's also the type of control that the American businesses have. What I've found in my research is that they've not just bought up assets like property, but they've bought what I call the bridges and the pipes of our economy. So in medieval times, the thing that you wanted to own was a bridge where you could charge people a toll and where it was the only way from one side of the river to another. And that's exactly what the Americans have done in so many areas. So, for example, if you do dating through Bumble or Tinder, you're maybe dating a British person, but you're paying an American for the privilege. Or if you sell something secondhand on eBay, you're again selling to a British person, but paying a royalty to the Americans for crossing their bridge. The same goes for using Airbnb. You book to stay in a cottage in Wales from a Welsh person maybe, and you're paying the Americans 15% for doing so. But even businesses that we think of as selling are actually often those bridges. So, for example, Amazon, almost two thirds of its sales are not things that they store in their warehouses and send out, but they're things where they're effectively organising the logistics, and a British person is buying from a British supplier, but paying the Americans on the way.
And of course, there's AWS, their web services, which it's out there, but when it's all sort of in black and white, that we have MI5, MI6, they base their internet properties off web services which are provided by Amazon.
So this is the cloud. The cloud is American owned, and it's either Amazon, Microsoft, Oracle, a little bit of Apple, a little bit of IBM, but they're all US companies. And we store all our critical data. Our government stores all its critical data there, and so do our businesses. And we pay for the privilege. Salesforce is another one where software is stored there. So we're very much beholden to them, and in the process, we're paying them for the opportunity to do business at all.
And again, I'm on the left, and I've thought about these things for a long time. But there's a few pages where you sort of basically illuminate lists, reams of all these firms and these bridges, these metaphorical bridges in the UK economy that have been purchased by the US. And after reading the book, I went to a retail park. I live in Hampshire, and it's full of SUVs. It's basically how the UK economy's moved in the last 20 years, encapsulates so much. One of which was these stores, and I'm looking at all of them, and I'm thinking, who owns that? So much of it's US private equity, or they're actually just US chains. And it really made me rethink quite a lot. You've talked about some of the examples, from the perspective of Novara. We operate obviously on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, but even the tools to edit this interview will be Adobe, which again is a software service, cloud-based product.
Yep, every company you've mentioned is American. Every company you've mentioned is highly profitable. And every company you've mentioned is pretty well indispensable for British production of podcasts and other media, and indeed for our day-to-day lives. But so much so that even when you want to submit tax returns, you're forced to use American software. So this is extraordinary, the extent to which the British state has adopted American software without question. And we've had opportunities to make a different choice. I mean, there was a company, and I illustrated in the book, there was a company in Manchester that was offering cloud services, and that could have been a local competitor to AWS and to Microsoft's Azure. And the government made the decision, short-term decision, to go for the cheapest supplier with the biggest capacity. And then that local company went out of business.
And what government was this? What year was this?
Well, it's actually that was 15 years ago, probably 18 now. And but so that was, as it happens, that was a Labour government, but it's been consistent between political parties. And in a way, that's the big. We're currently in a general election period, and that's the striking thing, that neither of the main parties, in fact, none of the parties, are highlighting this as an issue. And nobody's saying, oh, we'll reduce the amount of foreign ownership, or we'll do something about promoting British enterprise, or we'll change the tax system to make it more attractive for entrepreneurs to hold on to their businesses rather than to sell out.
Well, to the contrary, you had this ridiculous story. I think only the FT talked about it because it was comments made to the FT. I think only the Telegraph covered it in addition to the FT, of Jeremy Hunt saying that the UK can have a $1 trillion company, homegrown, grows through UK capital markets, which for people watching, they might think, okay, $1 trillion is a lot of money, but maybe Europe's most valuable company is around $500 billion, I think, right now. It's a race between LVMH and Novo Nordisk, these weight loss drug people. But also, I think the FTSE itself is worth about $2 trillion. So 50% of the FTSE through one company. So if anything, rather than actually addressing some of the points in the book, which we'll get onto, the default is still very much denial that this is an issue.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a fantasy on Jeremy Hunt's part. To get a company of that size in the UK with current government policies is so unlikely to happen. I mean, you talked about the scale of some of these bigger companies. I mean, if you take the FTSE 100 and add to it the next 250 biggest quoted companies, so the FTSE 350, that is smaller now, all added together, including our Shell and BP and Glaxo and everything. That's smaller now than just Microsoft. It's also smaller than Apple separately, and it's the FTSE 100 is now smaller than Nvidia, a US chip company that most people haven't heard of. But that indicates what a tiny player we've become. So Jeremy Hunt's ambitions to have a £1 trillion company, or $1 trillion company for that matter, are really fantasy, and they're not consistent with his policies on tax and innovation.
We'll get onto the policies in a minute, but I just about remember sort of the economy of the 2000s. For a brief moment, I think Vodafone was more valuable than Intel. Its market capitalization was higher than Intel. And you could look at these stats and say 2006, 2007, which was really the high watermark of that UK services-based Southeast England model. And, the top 20 biggest companies in the world, of course, BP, Shell, RBS, HSBC. And, the UK was a really major economic player. But actually, today, I think, I looked yesterday, even France has 3 companies by market capitalization bigger than any UK firm. And that, I don't think, really registers in the conversation in this country. The political class sort of seem to think we're still operating 20 years ago.
Yes, the political class don't want to think about numbers, as we know. We're run by arts graduates, and numbers actually, it turns out, rather matter. And Britain has shrunk, its place in the world has shrunk, but it's not just shrunk in relation to everyone. It's been very much taken over by the US. I mean, to give an illustration of that, the US has a lot of foreign investments around the world, but on my calculations, about 30%, almost a third of those investments of the US all around the world, about 30% are in the UK. It's hugely focused on the UK, and that's because we've welcomed them so much, and they've done very well here. And of course, we represent a bridgehead to Europe, but we also represent in ourselves an important profit centre for many big US corporations.
So a Tory minister watching this would be saying, fantastic, that's great news. Your point is that actually there's an exploitative nature to that.
Absolutely. I mean, many Americans listening to it would say this is a great success story. And of course, many Tory ministers would. And culturally, they are very, not just Tory, but Labour ministers have been very close to the Americans. I did a quick study of prime ministers and chancellors and found out that almost all of them, without exception, over the last 20 years, have either worked for American companies before they came into office or after they left office. I'm including their doing speaking tours for American companies. But yeah, you're right. Some politicians would say this is a success story, but I think they're wrong. I think they're fundamentally wrong. When you're sending about $100 billion of profits back to America every year, inevitably it leads to the impoverishment of the country. And we can see that because if we look at the average income per household, it's now about the same as Mississippi, the poorest of the US states and notoriously poor. So we have become impoverished by it. But also our taxes are partly higher partly as a result of this, because if the American corporations are paying very little tax, individuals have to pay more. So it's meant that we're poorer, we're paying higher taxes, but it's done other things too. It's reduced our community. One thing I came across in this study was how much many towns depend on a key employer. And we've lost that in cities like Birmingham, in Bourneville, and many in Street in Somerset with Clark's shoes going. But many cities and towns, we've lost our what you might call hometown advantage, the advantage of having a local employer, maybe with the owners living there as well, but where they'll create apprenticeships and they'll pay for community resources and leisure centres and so on. We've lost that. By contrast, you see that all across America. that towns are expanding and have done very well on the basis of this hometown advantage. And great if you've got a company like Dow Chemical in Midland, where they've got not only is the company very profitable and has been generous towards the local community, but the owners of the business, the Dow family, have been giving lots of resources to the city. So we've lost that. But it's not just that, we lose people. I think I'd say to your Tory minister, I'd say, what do you say about the capable young people who go out to the States because they're offered more attractive jobs? You can't blame them. But what it means is the more powerful country can pick and choose to some extent who it takes in academia and in science. But we also lose treasure. I mean, the amount of artworks going across the Atlantic each year is about £4 billion worth. That's works of art often
$4 billion?
4 billion, yeah, often going to the Getty Museum or other American institutions. I mean, that's the nature of a successful empire, isn't it? That they have a lot of wealthy individuals, a lot of wealthy companies, and they want treasure. And if they're free to buy it, and they buy it from Europe, and particularly from Britain.
The point about art is fascinating to me. I didn't know it was £4 billion a year. In the book, you talk about the example of one of my favourite artists, Joseph Wright of Derby. Amazing. You know, you see just what it must have been like, the sort of early decades of the Industrial Revolution. And you talk about a painting that was sold across the Atlantic, I think £3.5 million, Joseph Wright Derby, two boys with a bladder, whatever, I can't
That's
remember.
it, yes.
He's very famous for the bell jar one, if people are wondering who the hell is Aaron talking about. They are sensational paintings. And it really got me thinking that on the one hand, we talk about returning the Parthenon marbles back to Greece, which I support, quite right. But it's interesting, at the very moment we're refusing to send that stuff over there, we're also sending, in a really important heritage of this country, the Industrial Revolution, we're sending that across the Atlantic.
Yes, we're repatriating treasure at the same time as being plundered. Yeah, it's a paradox, and very little noticed or commented on. I mean, the best that the British government have done is they've said, well, we'll have a period of pause when someone wants to export a work of art, they must put a notice out to the museums to say, would you like to buy it? Well, that's all very well in a world where we had enough money to do so, but again and again, the British Museum itself and other museums in Britain say, actually, we can't afford it. We've spent our budget for acquisitions this year, or we're in a divesting mode.
I mean, it seems like a fair trade to me. Give the Parthenon marbles back, give the Benin bronzes back, and we'll get Joseph Wright of Derby. I quite like that. But anyway, that was a real shock to me, that 4 billion figure. And like you say, you use the words there, an empire, and often, and it's very important to say, you use the words. This is a book about business, not politics.
It's mostly about business, and it's very much pro-British rather than anti-American.
Yes.
I'm not anti-American in it, but I think the business spills over to the politics in many important ways. It's the Americans don't just have a business interest abroad; they have business interests that they support. And in the last few years, the number of people, for example, in the American embassy has gone up by 50%. They're not diplomats. They're not concentrating on. Some of them are, but the extra ones aren't concentrating on more diplomatic activity. They're concentrating on supporting their businesses. And there are many situations where there are questions about regulations where the American government lobby very heavily in favour of US companies. And of course, they want to retain control. Elon Musk says that Twitter is our town square, which was a reasonable description of it. Our town square in that case, is controlled from California. But that's true of Facebook, Meta as well. So we've allowed, and I think that relates to politics too, because these are places where our political discussions take place. But I mean, fundamentally, if we want to make a political decision that the Americans don't agree with, we will hear about it and it will change. Often it's behind closed doors, but there was a case a few years ago under Boris Johnson with Huawei, where the Americans didn't want us to have Huawei kit in our telecoms equipment, and they said so, and we said, oh, well, we'll look at it. And the British government consulted the experts in the intelligence community, and the experts said, no, it's fine. There are one or two places where we shouldn't have it, but it's fine in telecoms towers. And the Americans, oh, no, it's not. And there was a huge public spat where Donald Trump said, you better not have it or there'll be no trade deal. By the way, there still isn't a trade deal. And the British said, well, okay then. And they climb down. So most of the time our interests are aligned enough that you don't get this sort of dispute. But if we step out of line, the Americans will make sure that we conform with what they think is important.
And we're having a debate right now about nuclear. Not nuclear power. That's the Chinese and the French, but nuclear submarines, or more specifically, Trident missiles, which of course are manufactured and serviced in the United States.
Yes.
And so when people talk about Trident independent nuclear deterrent, we can, some people would say it's not a deterrent. We don't have to go there today. It's very questionable whether or not it's independent, because if you have something which is being serviced in a foreign country, it strikes me that's arguably not the case.
In the political debate, I've not heard it called independent for some years now. I think the reality is that government and civil servants are stopping using that expression because they know that that's a sham. That there's no situation politically or technically where it could be used independently of the Americans.
Well, technically is the one I find interesting, right? I mean, politically that's fine because you're in I don't think it's fine, but you're in a political alliance, you have collective security. I sort of grasp that. But technically is the one I find fascinating because I haven't got especially strong views on nuclear weapons. I think fewer countries should have them. I think we should ideally have a world without nuclear weapons. But I understand the arguments about, well, why would you want to get rid of them when you're allowing Iran to have them, et cetera, et cetera. I think wealthier countries should have as few as possible. I think that's a sensible way to go. What I find fascinating is that there aren't centre-right politicians in this country saying, we want nuclear weapons, but it should be a homegrown version like the French. That's what I find fascinating. And I think sometimes the argument of for or against misses that broader point, actually, because you care so much about this. You're saying the literal defence of the realm is impossible without this technology, and yet we depend on it from elsewhere.
Yes, we've got some very weird thinking going on in government when it comes to our relations with the US. And one of the things is we say, we wouldn't allow say the Telegraph to be taken over by a foreign owner, but it depends what you mean by foreign. If it's from the Middle East, no, definitely not. If it's from America, well, maybe they're not so foreign after all. But for me, foreign is foreign. And the British ought to and should be able to control their own destiny and their own assets.
Well, Rupert Murdoch at News International, he is a US citizen.
He is, and he's effectively sold Sky TV, so that's now American. Again, many people think of it. What we find is that when corporations are taken over by Americans, they often don't rebrand as American. They allow people to carry on thinking of them as British organisations. So Boots the chemist still uses all the reference to Nottingham and the 19th century. But, Boots is owned by Walgreens in America. The same goes for recent takeovers. When Hotel Chocolat was taken over by Mars Corporation a few months ago, they carried on referring it to a British chocolate maker. So they're quite sensible in keeping the local branding. And the result is that many ordinary people, and indeed many people in the policy community, don't realise just how many of our companies, of the companies with which they trade, are US owned. It goes down to everything. Coffee shops, people think Costa is owned by Whitbread. Well, it was, but now it's owned by Coca-Cola. And
Caffè Nero as well is owned by...
Caffè Nero is owned by an American who lives in London, an American individual.
Right. And Starbucks, obviously.
Starbucks is obviously from Seattle. A lot of coffee sold by McDonald's. Pretty well the coffee markets, the retail coffee market's sewn up. High margin market, and one where it's increasingly hard for people to compete.
Do your patriotic duty. Go to Wetherspoons. I wouldn't say that. It's illy. It's not bad coffee, but before people have a go at me, I'm not suggesting that for a moment.
But that does hit on an interesting problem. If you're unhappy about so much being owned by the Americans, is the right thing to do to start acting in a sort of hair-shirted way and say, I'm not going to order any from Amazon, I'm not going to go to Starbucks. It seems to me that is not a formula that works in terms of the long term. It's policy change we need. We need the government to have a buy British policy. The Americans have a buy British policy. Most European countries have the Americans have a buy American policy, and most Europeans have a buy local policy, but British don't.
The thing you said about Boots as well is fascinating. We made a TikTok about the history of Boots a few months ago. Obviously, Florence Boot, Jessie Boot, and this is still capitalism. This is still private firms. Nobody's suggesting it's radical or revolutionary. I don't want people to think that for a moment. But it really that story of the Boots firm and what it's become, I think really shows you an extraordinary trajectory for British capitalism over the last 100 years. People don't know this, but I think, is it Nottingham University? A lot of their estates were given to them, bequeathed to them by Florence Boot. At one point, it was the most popular working class library in the country, Boots. And what it's become instead is effectively a tax dodging, exploitative company, which rips off the NHS through prescriptions and whatnot. And it's effectively a means of sending large amounts of money from this country to the United States. And that shows you how much has changed. Now, and your book just gives example after example. You said Bourneville a moment ago, and Clark's. I've not heard the Clark's one. Can you go into that?
Well, Bourneville was Cadbury's. So Cadbury's was taken over by Kraft, wasn't it? And
with the RBS funding it.
With RBS funding it,
crazy.
and with various undertakings about what factories they'd keep open, which were not able to be delivered. Well, Street in Somerset is a town that used to be dependent on one business, Clark's shoes, and it was a very successful company and a very prosperous town. And when Clark's effectively declined with the growth of Far Eastern manufacturing, the town lost its heart and lost a lot of its wealth, and certainly lost the apprenticeships. And so that's been typical of the decline of the UK. But in many cases, that's because companies have been taken over by US.
So that sounds more like a post-industrial story, whereas Bourneville, arguably Boots with Nottingham, less so. I mean, you can point to an inflection point of a takeover by a US company. Are there any other sort of major examples? I mean, Kraft is not US, but are there any other major examples?
No, Kraft is US.
Is it? Is it not Swiss? Or it's
no,
Swiss?
No, you're thinking of Nestle. No, Kraft is US.
It is, isn't it?
Absolutely. And so there are quite a lot where the takeovers have happened recently. So something like Arm in Cambridge.
Yeah.
And with a company like that, of course, they like having the research facility there. But ultimately, the big decisions for that company are going to be made where the headquarters are and where the listing is. So that's owned partly by American corporations, partly by Japanese, and it's listed in New York now. So I think that there's a whole question about the relisting of companies where, because of CRH, the builder's merchant, recently moved to have an American listing, Flutter, the gambling company. But even huge companies like Shell have seriously considered relisting from London to New York. And you can see why. With higher valuations there, it's going to be better for the executives, but also it's going to be better for the shareholders. So there are reasons why people want to relist there. But it seems to me that that's quite damaging to London. But it's the first step in a company changing its nationality.
So what are the major? You said that are undervalued, and it's something I've heard in circulation a lot. FTSE companies are undervalued. Explain why that is.
I think it's partly because American institutions are better funded and take a longer term view. It's partly because it's thought that they will prosper more in the US environment, lower regulations, more scope for expansion. So it's about creating an environment in which they'll do well. But we could take the view, the British government could take the view that it doesn't allow takeovers in the same way that it's done so in the last 20 or 30 years. At the moment, we've got a real jumble sale going on. All sorts of businesses are being taken over, and the government show no concern about it. There's a big computer software cybersecurity company in Cambridge called Dark Trace. That's just being taken over by Thoma Bravo, which is a specialist in US, Chicago-based specialist in software companies, and they know what to do. It's so predictable what they'll do. They'll gear up to buy it. Nothing wrong with that. Well, perhaps there is, because that gearing will reduce their tax significantly and perhaps increase risk. They'll gear up to buy it. They'll tend to increase prices if there are other businesses or anything to go by. They'll tend to reduce costs, and they'll achieve what they call synergies, which means sort of cross-selling and buying collectively. So it's a well-worn path, and the British government and policymakers are doing very little, if anything, about it.
The Cadbury example is great because I think Peter Mandelson at that time was the trade czar, and you had the loan, I think it was a £7 billion loan from RBS to Kraft to buy Cadbury. So at that point, it was a taxpayer-owned bank, all the more remarkable. And ultimately, I think it re-domiciles in Switzerland. I think the tax domicile changes. They lay off workers and they increase the amount, I think temporarily because now it's changed, and I think they increased the amount of sugar in the chocolates. The quality of the chocolate deteriorated, including famously the cream eggs.
Yes.
So it's quite remarkable that a publicly owned, taxpayer-backed bank is financing this crazy set of outcomes, and politicians aren't really aware of it being, a bad idea.
But one of the reasons these takeovers are so attractive to the US multinationals and indeed other multinationals is because they can, to some extent, to a large extent, eliminate tax. And that makes a company more attractive if you can. And there are so many legitimate legal ways they can do that. But particularly it's around what's called transfer pricing, so that you put your trademarks in an offshore location such as the Cayman Islands, and then your local UK subsidiary pays these for the use of these trademarks, pays large sums to the tax haven, and it reduces the local taxes, local profits, and almost it sometimes eliminates the local tax, while the real profit is taken into the tax haven where it's tax free. So this is something we could do something about, but it's actually quite difficult for the British in some ways to act on it, because of the 10 major tax havens, the British control 8. So we would have to be quite radical. And there has been talk about it by chancellors, but it's only been talk. We'd have to be quite radical in what we do with our tax havens. So far, all they've gone for is more transparency, saying, well, you've got to say who owns what. But that doesn't deal with the core issue of allowing them to operate in that way.
All the things you're talking about, they're coded as left-wing. It's coded as tax avoidance, tax evasion, taking on the tax havens. I genuinely don't understand, Angus, how over the last 10 years these haven't become mainstream demands amongst centre-right politicians, centre-right party activists, voters. I find it absolutely crazy. The thing you said about the trademark, what's the deal with Starbucks in the Netherlands? So how does that work? Because I've heard something like that. They route certain taxes through certain jurisdictions. I'm a bit confused. So if you can clarify that, I'd be grateful.
Well, I have to be careful what I say about an individual corporation, because these companies can be litigious. But from what Reuters have researched, it's clear. It seems clear that Starbucks have got a long record of minimising their tax within the law, but certainly not within the spirit of the law. So that they've put their trademarks, I think, in the Cayman Islands, and they can do their have subsidiaries owned in Amsterdam, and they can do their. I think things like trading in coffee, if it goes through in commodities, profits on that are very lowly taxed in places like Switzerland. So anyway, it's not about one particular corporation. It's a pattern of behaviour that they show. And actually, one of the biggest tax havens is Ireland. So Apple and Ancestry.com and lots of the big tech companies, Facebook, and lots of the big US pharma companies, they trade through Ireland. So they're selling into the UK through Ireland with a much lower tax rate, typically 12.5% if they're paying the official rate, or if they've got a special deal, far lower, sometimes almost zero, not much above zero. But it's been great for Ireland, because they get about almost 20% of their budget, government budget, paid for by the taxes that they do collect at these lower rates.
On this topic of Ireland, you also mention in the book about how multinationals kind of cook the books. I don't mean that in a sort of accusatory way. They can confuse perhaps GDP figures and what they're meant to express. So often when we think of GDP, we think of quality of life, we think of prosperity. GDP per capita is obviously a very good way of judging that. Ireland's GDP per capita is about twice that now. It's getting there. Twice that of the UK. And if you go to Ireland, it doesn't look twice as wealthy as much of the UK. And presumably that's because of these tax dodging multinationals. Absolutely.
The scale of movements through the tax havens is such that it distorts the position in the world tables of GDP. And so countries that look as if they're quite highly, quite important in GDP terms, like Switzerland and Ireland and Singapore, once you take out what are effectively tax-driven transactions, their position in the tables drops right down. So yes, what I found was that the British were very reluctant to produce any figures on on this. They don't collect them. Some of what they do collect, they don't make public. But the Americans are much more open and much more systematic in their collecting of numbers. And I struck a rich seam with the Internal Revenue Service. There's an obscure page. It's absolutely not advertised anywhere, and you have to search quite hard to find it. And when you do, you can't just cut and paste it because it's a directory to various PDFs. Anyway, one of those is a set of PDFs of a spreadsheet of all the countries that American corporations trade with, the big multinationals, and how much profit they make and how much tax they pay on it, how many people they employ. It is 2 or 3 years out of date because it takes them time to collect and collate the information, but it's an absolute treasure trove, and it ought to be looked at far more by the British. I mean, here we are, the country is deeply penetrated by a foreign economic power, and we're not even watching, we're not even measuring. And that economic power is telling us what they're doing, if only we'd read their numbers. So, for example, the US multinationals' annual turnover in the UK is now $800 billion. Put that into sterling, divide by 28 million homes in this country, and that's equivalent to £23,000 per household, is the equivalent of how much US sales there are in the UK. So it's big. But they're willing to give these numbers, and we're just not reading them. I mean, I spoke to, I did an interview with Philip Hammond, who was very good, actually, and very helpful. But he
Former
Chancellor. But he was under the misapprehension that the Americans employ just 1 million Brits. And these figures reveal that it's well over 1.5 million. And actually, if you include indirect employees, people like Uber and Amazon Flex drivers, it's probably 2 million Brits working for American corporations. So about twice what the British think it is. So the penetration is far deeper and wider than the establishment are willing to accept, and they're just not looking at the numbers.
Yeah, you have a stat here which is that US corporations have more employees in the UK than France, Germany, Portugal, Italy and Sweden combined.
Absolutely, and that's of course authoritative because that comes from the Americans' own figures from the IRS.
Yeah, I mean, those aren't small countries. France, Germany, Italy, they're G7 economies.
No, so Germany's a bigger country than ours, and while we've got 2 million British employees work for Americans, the Germans only have 450,000. But in southern Europe, in Spain and Italy, each of those countries only have 200,000 working for American corporations. Nothing wrong with working for American corporations, but it's a good way of measuring the extent to which they've taken control of the economy.
There's a great quote here as well in the book, before we move on. Amazing quote from Denny Ludwell from 1930. America conquers Britain. We were Britain's colony once. She will be our colony before she's done. Well, we're not done yet. I mean, the Scots might have something to say that in the next few years, but we're not there yet. Not in name, but in fact. But we shan't make Britain's mistake. Too wise to govern the world, we shall merely own it. Nothing can stop us. Nothing. What chance has Britain got against America?
Absolutely, very prescient writer. And he was talking. He did a lot of analysis of how well the Americans were doing industrially in the early 20th century. But he could see the future, and of course the real turning point was the Second World War, when Britain emerged basically bankrupt, and the Americans had extracted such a price to help with the sort of gunboats for bases deal, which Churchill said he had no choice but to do, and perhaps he was right. But from then on, the American economic machine was moving across Britain. But I think nothing compared to the last 15 years. This is I think where people say, oh, we've always had Ford at Dagenham, we've always had American companies here, but it's about the scale of it. And as we've moved to a digital world, that's a digital world which is owned by Americans. And as we've moved to from quoted companies, an economy dominated by quoted stock market companies, to a world of bigger, more private companies, the private equity world, that's where the Americans have really, really cleaned up.
I mean, that is key, because if we had Peter Hitchens in here, he would say that the British Empire dies in 1940, 1941, Dunkirk, fall of Singapore, and that after that we become effectively some sort of dependency on the United States. And I think that's That's right. The Second World War has started, or it involves two European colonial powers. It's ended by these two non-European, if you don't include the USSR, hyperpowers, which they form the two rivals of the Cold War. I think that's true. But like you say, with this book, actually, we don't need to sort of dig and look back 80 years. This is really since the arrival of the World Wide Web and the early 2000s.
Yes. And it doesn't have to be like this. It's not as if, some people say, oh, well, this is happening all over the world. But we represent a third of American foreign investments. We've been taken over to an extent that France and Germany haven't. And yet they are still under the NATO umbrella. So it's not like we have to sell all our businesses in order to have a mutual pact for military protection. They're different things. And it's one thing to believe in free trade, which the British and the Americans and most of the Europeans do. But it's not the same as believing in free trade in our companies. We don't have to allow everything to be taken over. What the French did famously when Pepsi-Cola wanted to take over their big milk and yogurt company, Danone, is they labelled it as a strategic asset. And they said, our strategic assets are protected from takeover, back off. And now Danone is still French-owned. And in a way, it was a strategic asset because one of its roles was to support local communities, to buy milk from small farmers and to support yogurt makers locally. And yes, it's industrial, but the French recognise the importance of keeping it within their control. And it's not just a matter of pride, but it's much more than that. It's about where the profits go, and it's about who regulates the companies. So the danger once you've got a business that's owned in America is an anonymous head office there across the Atlantic on another continent can be making big decisions about layoffs and priorities and regulation, whether even they want that branch of the company to exist.
I suppose somebody might be watching this and there might be sort of, ultra-liberal person. They'd be, two bigots, they're talking about, putting Britain first, British pride. There's a very material, as I'm a socialist, you do not want to be siphoning off profits to somewhere else. You want your workers to enjoy high labour standards. You want to be able to collect taxes from the companies operating and selling goods and services in this country. And I think there's a very important left wing. I think there's also, it's not entirely left wing, but I think over the last 20, 25 years, people from the left have thought, well, particularly the centre left, people like the Mandelson wing of the Labour Party, if they're centre left, centre, they would say, well, this is just, it doesn't matter where they're from, it's unimportant. Actually, it's very important if you want to provide a well-resourced public sector.
Absolutely. My favourite question in the last 3 years has been, who owns that? And of course, I've been using my Apple American computer or phone, and I've been using Google, American-owned, but it doesn't matter. They provide good information on this. And when I search who owns that company, it's amazing how often the answer is an American corporation. Just to give an example, we thought of during the COVID pandemic, the British with AstraZeneca were the first to develop a vaccine, and yet at the end of the time, 2/3 of the vaccines were being bought. Almost exactly 2/3 were bought from American companies. So BioNTech and Pfizer, which we just thought, these are kind of familiar names. These weren't just any names. These were names of American corporations. So I think it does matter who owns them, and I think we can easily find out using Google and our phone. Yeah.
And the point about France, I think, is key. I think France does so many things better than the UK, so many things. And people say, well, its GDP is lower than ours. It's because they work less. They choose to literally work less. They retire earlier. They have a shorter working week. Their GDP per capita, if they work the same as us, would be higher because their productivity is higher. But besides all the, high-speed rail, the fact that they've got, I think 90% of their electricity comes from nuclear, which they build, their nuclear capability in terms of warheads and whatnot, entirely domestic. They have a domestic, to be fair, we're also with aviation, we share that with them somewhat. They have a domestic industrial manufacturing sector, which we basically gave up. That's prior to a lot of this stuff, and that's about political choices in the 80s and the 90s.
Aaron, I would say it's worse than that. It's not that we gave it up. We're still giving it up. This process of selling off companies is happening right now. There are companies that are being taken over. Two big defence companies, Ultra and Meggitt, were sold in the last 3 or 4 years. But there are companies now that are subject to takeover. Dark Trace in Cambridge, but Wincanton's just been sold, a big haulage company with 20,000 staff. So what I'm saying is that it's not just that we gave up what industry we had, we're still giving it up. It's a process that's going on right now, and it ought to be a big issue in the current general election.
Well, maybe this will be the game changer interview, but maybe we'll have to wait a little bit for that. There is a great stat in the book about tech firms. And this is another one that, is another touchstone of modern politics. All the politicians love to say, we're innovative, we're new, we're, technologically in touch. Again, going back to Jeremy Hunt, he said that $1 trillion company would, of course, be a tech giant. And you say the FTSE 100, when it was launched in 1984, had more tech firms than it does today. Just to be clear, the FTSE 100 is the 100 most valuable listed companies in the UK. That's a remarkable statistic. So how did you work that out? And what are you classifying there as a technology company?
Well, it's interesting because if you look at the very few tech companies we've got left, they aren't really tech companies. So I think probably Rightmove and Auto Trader are the only two. And really they're using tech, but really they're marketplaces, aren't they? And so in terms of pure tech companies, we've probably got the accounting firm in Newcastle. That's about it, really. So we basically lost them all. But in many cases, I mean, DeepMind was a classic case, which was a very promising tech company, which Google took over very cheaply, as it turns out. But I'm sure Google knew it was a bargain at the time. So we've allowed these takeovers to happen. In fact, we've even encouraged them. A friend of mine had a tech company which he sold, and he said to me, by selling it now, I got my entrepreneur's relief allowance. I'll pay maximum of 10% tax. If I carry on trading, I'll pay 40% or more tax on the trading profits. So it pays me to sell. So we've set up a tax system where entrepreneurs want to sell. But we could find other ways of encouraging people who build up businesses to hold on to them. That's what the Germans have done with their Mittelstand. So they've got a lot of companies, very often specialized in a particular niche, very often exporters, very often set up soon after the war, family businesses, but with a kind of extended family and community around them. And they wouldn't sell even for a profit because it'd be socially unacceptable. They're embedded in their community. They provide jobs. They wouldn't be able to face their community if they turned around and said, we sold out to a foreigner. So it's not just about the tax. It's also about the culture of keeping hold of your companies and building them up, owning companies to grow them rather than to sell them. In fact, it's one rather depressing thing about British business advice these days. They always talk about what's your exit strategy. Anyone who's been in a business discussion will have been involved in these discussions. Well, maybe there isn't an exit strategy. Maybe it's a stay in the room strategy. Maybe it's a grow the room strategy. So it's there's a cultural issue as well as a tax issue.
So you say culture. That's fascinating because maybe you don't know, Angus. I'm a Marxist. Okay, don't hold it against me. And Karl Marx would say that capital is money which makes money. It's value in motion, and you're always seeking a higher rate of return. You're in competition with other capitalists, and that the asset management, private equity model, globalized core periphery relations with the US and the rest of the world, you can map all of that onto that sort of Marxist framework, and it makes perfect sense. There's a higher rate of return by boots being bought by these people, and effectively you buy low and you sell high, or you reduce your costs, you keep onto it, you move your tax base, do all these things. That can all be explained through Marx essentially saying that's how business operates. Then you're making, you say, the cultural argument, and this is empirically what happens, right? In Germany, France, Italy, there are very large family-owned companies that wouldn't do this, and they sort of fly in the face of that ultra-capitalist argument of maximizing revenues, shareholder returns, blah, blah, blah. So what would be your sort of political response then? Because I've given the critique, if that is the direction of a purely capitalist society, and you never really live in a purely capitalist society. Sorry to bore you, but when Marx writes Capital, it's called Capital, a Critique of Political Economy. He's criticizing ideas of political economy rather than the actual existing economy. But it's an abstract set of values that we seem to be moving further towards in the Anglo-American countries, and it's a slightly less developed set of things in set of relations rather in continental Europe. So what are you saying? We should be more like continental Europe? You say it's a cultural thing. How does that work? That would have to be necessarily sort of like nationalist, I suppose, or what, social democratic, or what's the...
Not necessarily. I mean, there are lots of things we could do to tweak our business rules to get closer to having family or locally owned or even cooperatively owned businesses. But we've actually moved them the other way. So one of the things that large businesses have is advantages of scale. Well, that can be countered in various ways. But a big advantage that they have is the advantage of this borrowing, using other people's capital. And that has the advantage for them that they can take over bigger targets. But it also has the advantage that interest payments on that capital are tax deductible. So one of the things that private equity does is it typically borrows so much that it doesn't actually need to pay tax in the short term. And very often when they sell out, they've got mechanisms to be able to do that what they call tax efficiently, or what you would probably say tax avoidingly. So we can tweak the rules to move nearer to your model. I don't think these changes will create a Marxist way of working, but it will be less capitalist. I think in a way what Britain needs to do is develop its own form of capitalism, closer to the European model, rather than adopting the US model lock, stock and barrel. And also by adopting the American model, as we've done, we've made ourselves very open to this wave of takeovers.
The book's called Vassal State. So I suppose if you're trying to condense it down then, by adopting that US variant of capitalism, we have effectively made ourselves open to sort of predatory takeover by US business.
I think we're a vassal state in that way, yes, that we've made ourselves more open. But I mean, a vassal is someone who works at the direction of someone else, and I think the British largely do. And I think a vassal is someone who works in order to enrich someone else, and I think in that sense the British do. But there's another meaning of vassal within the British economy, that we've created a sort of vassal class, a group of people who work really very much at the margin. They can't afford to get ill. I'm thinking of people like Amazon workers, and it's not a particular criticism of the way Amazon does something. It's a criticism of the whole system of having employees who are working at the minimum wage, having to live in places where it's expensive to live, having to get to work without costs, not having adequate insurance cover for when things don't go right. So I mentioned in the book James Bloodworth's book, which is an excellent analysis of how in the real world American capitalism works for Uber drivers and for Amazon workers. And because he went underground for 6 months with each of 4 very low paid jobs to experience what it was like. And what he says is that it's all right as long as it's all right. But then if you get an injury, there's no one there to support you. And I think the British model after the war and right through the 60s and into the 70s, the British model was and still should be that we're there to support each other, and that we don't want to have people who are made destitute because things don't work out for them.
So effectively a social democratic model is what you're talking about here?
Certainly something less brutal than we've got with the workers in many of these companies.
So when Labour in the last election talked about a national investment bank and also regional investment banks, is that a policy that you think, okay, if we're trying to build an ecology a bit like Germany, that's something we should try?
Well, it depends how those would work. There's been constant talk of new banks, and then they're typically not funded by people very well, and not run by people who've got a clear vision of what they're trying to do. But yeah, finance is important, and I think we probably should have banks that support certain sorts of enterprise that are socially desirable. What you've got at the moment is banks who are motivated to support businesses that they're not worried about what the business does. They're amoral in a sense. So they're motivated to support customers who have a lot of collateral and can make the interest payments. Well, that's natural for a banker. But so yeah, I think we should have a a better banking system for enterprise.
Well, particularly for co-ops, right? I mean, co-ops often they can compete perfectly well with private firms. The problem is during a crisis, they struggle to access finance during an economic downturn because, of course, I mean, I'll spell it out. If you're a large bank and somebody says, one firm says, I need 500,000, or 10 firms say we need 50,000, the 500,000 is a better bet. If it's a good customer, obviously. So it's something when I was writing my book, I found really fascinating that access to credit during a crisis is the real pinch point for co-ops historically.
But actually, crises are at the heart of capitalism.
Yes.
I mean, it's a sort of punctuated equilibrium sort of issue, that it's not just about what happens, when things are running smoothly. It is very much, as you say, about what happens in the crisis. And my reading of it is that with private equity in particular, this is a kind of a mechanized industry of people who are looking for a crisis. They're not looking for a crisis in the economy or their own. They're looking for a crisis in a particular industry. And when that happens, they're ready to take over at rock bottom prices. And so we're talking about the constant churn of businesses, and we've now got this group of people who are some people have described as being like vultures, but I mean they're business people, but they're looking for opportunity. And so if you're a private company and you're in trouble, you may get taken over, but at a very low price.
Have you read Brett Christopher's on asset management? I think you'd really like it. Asset management and wealth management, and another book as well. When I'm reading this, and I'm thinking it's good for our audience. You can go on and watch this on YouTube. It's Techno-Feudalism by Yanis Varoufakis. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, very much. Yeah.
And I actually thought reading this, this Brett Christopher's and Yanis, it's kind of it's a similar story. You're all sort of telling. On the techno-feudalism point, and again, you talk about all the different firms from just everything. It's crazy that we depend on with the US. And then you go on to payment services, Apple Pay, Visa, MasterCard, obviously Google Pay. I mean, when I swiped in coming from London Waterloo to Bermondsey, I use Apple Pay. And obviously a tiny fragment of that payment goes across the Atlantic. Yeah,
not necessarily that tiny. Yeah, what's happened is the US payment companies have killed cash. They wanted it to die. We're now at a point where of our transactions in the high street, 14%, so only 1 in 7 are done with cash. And many shops and businesses refuse to take cash. But it's not what consumers often think is, oh, well, this is happening all over the world. It's not. In Germany, 58% of transactions are with cash. They've chosen cash because it's very cheap, much cheaper for the shopkeeper. It's very easy to handle. It has some other advantages too. You're more aware of what you've spent if you use cash, whereas, as they say, the credit card anaesthetizes the pain of spending. And so that's, of course, very good for the credit card companies. But there's another thing about cash. If you're thinking of normal, ordinary people, that cash allows you to budget. And many people still use cash in jam jars to work out their budget, and why shouldn't they? It's a good way to do it. But it's a bit pointless if you worked out your budget, you've got your cash to spend on something, you can't use it. So the credit card companies took the view that cash wasn't doing them any good, whereas in credit card payments, they're always getting something. It's not just the front companies as well. It's the processing companies that are American-owned, companies like WorldPay, which pops up on the screen when you've touched it with your phone or with your card. This is another example of sort of almost where we started, of bridges and pipes. It's a pipe you have to go through to make your payment, and they're taking a royalty on the way.
It's incredible, really, because we spoke to a guy called Brett Scott, and he talked about cashless, and he said you have to at least keep a certain amount of your monetary infrastructure should be physical cash, has to be, and he sets out the reasons why. And so far, the people defending cash have been people like Nigel Farage, who are the tribunes of the petty bourgeois in this country. And it's really interesting if you look at it as a sociological difference. If you go, I live in Portsmouth. If you go and if I hang out with the partner of my sister-in-law, wardrobe of cash, he's a tradesman, right? Carpet fitters, builders, cash. If I'm with my colleagues here at Novara Media, London graduates, it's all cashless. It's a really notable sociological divide between the petit bourgeois and, you might say, graduate of the future or graduate class. And politically, actually, I had never thought about it again until reading the book. The big takeaway, actually, is if we're looking at this through the prism of US imperial relations, you absolutely want to keep cash. You absolutely want it. Or if you're going to have a cashless system, it should be publicly owned. It should be based in the UK.
Yes, exactly. We could have our own credit card system. We did. We had a company called Access, and we quietly allowed it to be taken over by MasterCard. There could have been a strategy by government to say this is a strategic asset. We want to have a nationally based credit card.
And when was that taken over?
That was a while ago.
I feel like I remember Access, but maybe I'm just maybe that's in my
25 or 30 years ago.
Right. Okay. Probably not then.
But they could have chosen not to do it. But there is no drive towards protecting national assets in that way. It's just there seems to be just a big hole in our policy making.
Well, you had that funny scenario a few months ago of Nigel Farage being debanked and then him saying, I want a bank of last resort and it should be publicly owned. It should be the post office. The post office used to be publicly owned and they would give you a bank account. You're thinking, Nigel Farage is coming out for a public ownership of financial infrastructure. Strange world we live in.
Yes, and the post office has just been taken over by a Czech buyer after 500 years of independence. I'm not saying for it or against it, but it doesn't seem to have been considered as a strategic asset, and there don't seem to be enough protections for ordinary consumers and ordinary workers, for that matter.
On Amazon, you said about cashless, great statistic. On Amazon, I think 30% of online retail in this country goes through Amazon. 30%, which is crazy. Should we just close it down? Should we just say, no, that's it, no more? What's the ideal solution, really? I know you'd say we should have alternatives based in the UK paying tax here, but in the short term.
What to do about all this is a big question, and it's not an easy question. We've got to start by recognising a problem, and that's sort of what Vassal State tries to do, to recognise the extent to which we're American-owned. Secondly, we've got to start measuring. It's an absurd thing to be trying to deal with an illness when you know there's an illness there, but you haven't properly diagnosed it, what it is. So we need to have a proper measure so that all government departments should measure how much of their expenditure is made with companies of each nationality. It's not an overly nationalistic thing to do. It's what other countries do. So start by recognising, then measure. Then I think we need to have a buy British policy, as other countries do. So conscious policy there. Then we need to adjust the tax system so that it's not so friendly towards debt and it's not so friendly towards foreign ownership. We need to make sure that tax is charged fully on companies from whatever country they come and reduce or eliminate transfer pricing. In terms of how we get there from problems that are already entrenched, well, that's difficult. We need a very powerful markets authority, mergers and markets group, and at the moment they're trying, but they're too weak. And yes, that could insist that companies operating here demerge different operations. So you could say, for example, that Amazon has to, but this is to some extent actually a Department of a US issue, that Amazon should be broken down into different size companies. I think the main thing is to reduce further takeovers. But yeah, it's also difficult, Aaron, because Amazon are good.
Great product.
They do deliver things the next day. They do have a great customer service, and it's very convenient. And they have a huge range of products. Pretty well anything you can buy anywhere. Not quite, but it's a very wide range. So we should be careful not to knock good service. But we've had our competitors, and they should be encouraged and incentivized to fill spaces in the market.
It is very good. I'm not going to lie. I've bought so many things off. I've got a Prime membership. It is very good, but also I look at the British High Street over the last 25 years, and it's been smashed to bits. I mean, if you, I like to call it London Okio. If you sort of if you're within an hour of London, you're fine. If you go to Winchester, you've got two Waterstones bookstores. You go a few hours west to Poole, 25 years ago, comparable wealth, comparable high streets, no bookshops. Because the point is, the people with those jobs need to live in London. you have this wholly different when it comes to offline commerce. There are some exceptions. You can go at Hay on Wye or Totnes, but or other major cities like Edinburgh. But broadly speaking, it's about the southeast and how close you are to London.
Absolutely. Yes. So we're a bit of an island of wealth and convenience and so on. But I mean, Waterstones is an interesting example. Somebody said, I'm not going to buy your book, Angus, on Amazon because I want to support British companies. So I'm going to go to Waterstones. And I said, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but Waterstones is owned by US private equity. So I said, well, I'll go to my local bookshop. Well, I said, good. But I mean, in terms of Prime, you give that as an example where you've got membership of it. You've got that because presumably you get free delivery on most things, and you get a certain number of free films, and you get quite a lot of things bundled together.
Yeah.
Now, this bundling is of goods together by the big companies is something that really should be challenged, because what it does is it prevents small companies getting into each of those sectors. It's a form of monopoly power to bundle stuff together. And it's very attractive to you and me as consumers to pay our 80 or 100 quid a year to be benefiting from that. But it's very anti-competitive, and bundling occurs all over the economy.
So maybe we don't ban Amazon, we just ban Amazon Prime.
Well, no, you could have Amazon Prime, but you could say that has to be only doing free delivery.
Yeah.
You have to have a different service that people buy for their videos and for their music from Amazon.
Because in France, as I understand it, I think there's like a minimum price on books. I might be getting this completely wrong. I think they've got 3 times as many sort of independent book shops as we do, because basically you're not really saving that much by buying it online is the point. Yeah. So there are things like that, and I'm totally in favour of that. I think that's a very good thing to do. But my point I was saying about what Amazon and what these big tech companies have really done to the UK high street over the last 25 years is terrifying. It's very bad. I actually think it's a big reason why we had Brexit. I think lots of people in lots of parts of the UK outside of the southeast walked around. They thought, where I live looks crap, looks awful. And my worry is with AI applications that really the changes over the last 25 years are just going to go stratospheric with AI, and it's going to be US-owned AI, and all the stuff you're talking about here is just going to go to a whole other level.
Absolutely. No, AI is American-owned, and to use ChatGPT, I pay my $20 a month. And I'm thinking, there it is, another, but I need to, because it's a good service. I would be happier to pay £20 a month to a UK AI company. But all the things that I've mentioned, the tax incentives and the structure of industry and the attitude of ministers and the way that government buys, often buying from US companies, all those things have meant that it's unlikely that a British AI company can succeed and prosper in the general market. So there are some good British AI companies in certain niches. But at the moment, as things stand, if they're successful, they will be bought up by Google and Facebook and others.
Final question. Is this all the legacy of Margaret Thatcher? She changed the political dial in this country in a certain direction and trying to embrace a more American-style capitalism.
I think it's one of those things, isn't it, that any discussion of the British economy always ends up with concluding that it was Thatcher that got us off on the wrong foot. I think she did have a very strong relationship with Reagan and with the Americans, and she was very admiring of American capitalism. But I think we've gone to a different scale. I think she would be horrified by the situation we're in now. She was quite analytical, and she would have seen the extent to which the Americans have taken over. So when she was in power, 3% of the US stock market was owned by Americans. It's now 30%. So even when we talk of a British company, we're really at best talking of a 70% owned British company, although with other foreign institutions, it's likely to be a 50% British company. So I think she would have been horrified by that. But I mean, there were examples, yes, when she fell out with Michael Heseltine over the takeover of Western Helicopters. She was supporting the takeover by Sikorsky, the American company that bought it in the end. So yeah, it wasn't just a general opening up of capital markets and welcoming of the American model. There were specific government policy decisions which she made to support specific American companies. So I think you're probably right. I think it did start with a lot of it started with Thatcher, but again, she was before the internet age.
Sure.
She gave it a completely different dimension, and obviously well before the AI age, which, as you say, will move things further on. But I mean, perhaps I can ask you, do you think your dream in your book of AI and other technologies creating more leisure time is going to mean that we won't worry so much about the American domination?
Well, no, it's something that, in that book, I couldn't really go into, obviously, geopolitics and the relationships between states, which is arguably a state of anarchy, right? It's different to, I think humans are inherently cooperative, but the evidence of the last several hundred years is that nation states are not inherently cooperative with other nation states. So that is something that, it troubled me in the book. And I quite overtly say, I think, in the final two chapters, that really the path from one to the other, because I do think that, that Economist headline from a few years ago, what happens when labour becomes capital? We're going to get there. We're going to see the plummeting price of human labour because increasingly uniquely human capabilities will disappear. I think the bridge from one form of political economy to another is going to be something which looks like a radical form of social democracy. And so when you're talking about, for instance, certain kinds of bank that can finance cooperatively owned business, or a different kind of British capitalism, I think in the short, over the next 20, 25 years, yes, certainly. I don't see that as, and I know that some people watching or listening might really strongly disagree. I don't disagree with that at all. The trends I talk about in that book are really over a century. Maybe, who knows, right? So there's still a place for markets. There's still a place for private firms. In the short term, I just don't want those anywhere near things of fundamental importance to human beings, which would be the universal basic services. If you want to be a private enterprise and make money, make phones. I don't want you anywhere near the water system. It's low margins anyway. It's quite hard to administer. I certainly don't want private equity there. So I think this analysis can fit in with that perfectly well. And it's interesting you said that about Thatcher. If she saw this, she'd be aghast, because I think she would be. That's what's fascinating to me now with contemporary British Conservatives, is that they helped create a model, a political economy over the last 40 years, which they don't like.
Yes, they've encouraged us to model ourselves on the Americans, and instead of just modeling ourselves on the Americans, we've created a system that's welcomed the Americans in. So many of the decisions on regulation and everything else are made in New York and Washington, and in California. One of the extraordinary things is just this sheer success of California in dominating not just online businesses, but all sorts of businesses where you can get scale by using the internet. And I think she would have been. That model wasn't in her vision at that time. In fact, it wasn't in anyone's vision until about 2000. Yeah.
This has been such a great conversation. I really enjoyed it, Angus.
Thanks, Aaron.
Vassal State, How America Runs Britain. I don't think it's a very left-wing book, but I think you might have some left-wing conclusions. Maybe you don't like me saying that. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure.